the two axioms of economics, and how societies break them. Most arguments about economics go nowhere. Capitalism versus socialism, free markets versus intervention, left versus right. But these debates usually happen above the foundations, not at them. Today, I want to do something much simpler and much more useful. I want to show that almost all of economics rests on two axioms, and that when societies deny them, they don't just fail intellectually, they can fail completely. The two axioms. Let's start at the bedrock. Axiom 1. Scarcity. Resources are limited, and at any moment, available means are insufficient to satisfy every possible use. This is not ideology. This is not capitalism. This is not pessimism. It's a physical condition of reality. Axiom 2. Choice by agents. Some agent, an individual, a family, a firm, a bureaucracy, or a state, must choose how scarce means are allocated among competing ends. No assumptions about markets, no assumptions about freedom, no assumptions about rationality. Scarcity, choice. If a system rejects either one, it is no longer doing economics. What follows automatically? Once scarcity exists and agents choose, several things follow, whether we like them or not. First, trade-offs exist. Choosing one use of resources means excluding another. Second, opportunity cost exists. Cost is not money. It's the value of the best alternative you didn't choose. Third, incentives matter. When choices have costs, behavior responds to consequences. Fourth, value becomes subjective. If agents choose among alternatives, value must be preference relative, not intrinsic. Finally, exchange and signals can emerge. Not just markets, but any system that transmits information about scarcity. None of this is ideological. It's mechanical. So now the real question is, what happens when societies deny these consequences anyway? Historical failure modes. Denial of scarcity. Soviet Union, 1928 to 1953. During this period, scarcity was officially framed as sabotage, hoarding, or ideological deviation, not as a structural condition. Agricultural shortfalls were blamed on enemies rather than limits, most notably so-called kulaks, labelled as petty bourgeois hoarders and class enemies. Accurate reporting was punished, while ideology was used to justify confiscation and repression. Enforcement relied on propaganda, forced requisitioning, rationing, and systematic scapegoating. The result was not merely inefficiency, but mass death. In the early 1930s, rigid planning targets and forced grain seizures contributed to famines across multiple regions, resulting in several million deaths, with mainstream estimates commonly ranging from 5 to 7 million. Scarcity didn't disappear. It was just punished for existing. The People's Republic of China, 1958 to 1962. The Great Leap Forward. Scarcity was denied outright in favor of abundance through political will. Local officials falsified grain production figures to meet targets, while the state requisitioned food based on imaginary outputs, leaving entire villages to starve. At the same time, the state mobilized millions into backyard steel furnaces, compelling households to melt tools, cookware, and farm equipment into largely unusable pig iron. This destroyed productive capital that would otherwise have been used in agriculture and industry, further collapsing output. Bad news was punished, accurate reporting suppressed, and planning proceeded on fiction. The result was one of the largest famines in human history, with tens of millions of excess deaths, commonly estimated between 15 and 30 million. The catastrophe was followed by a quiet ideological retreat and a reversal of policy. When scarcity is denied, the system must lie, and then discipline reality for not cooperating. Denial of meaningful choice. Germany, 1933 to 1945. Scarcity was acknowledged, but meaningful choice was subordinated to ideological and geopolitical destiny. Allocation decisions were increasingly centralized and directed toward rearmament, autarky, and territorial expansion. The result was a massive misallocation of resources, progressively converting the entire economy into a war machine. This strategy relied not only on expansion, but on the systematic extraction of capital, labor, and productive assets from conquered and occupied territories. Industrial equipment, raw materials, financial reserves, and labor were redirected toward sustaining the war economy rather than productive renewal. This temporarily masked internal constraints while deepening long-term fragility. The eventual collapse was not an external accident, but the predictable outcome of systemic overextension. The state exhausted its productive base, multiplied enemies, and destroyed the conditions required for long-term coordination. France, 1945 to 1975. The dirigiste planning era. Scarcity was accepted, but economic choice was displaced upward into elite planning institutions under the assumption that rational coordination by the state could substitute for decentralized decision-making. In this period, the state acted as a central economic agent, setting priorities for investment, industrial structure, and national champions. This model proved effective during post-war reconstruction, when objectives were narrow, conditions were damaged but well understood, and growth came primarily from rebuilding existing capacity. Over time, however, economic complexity increased faster than planning capacity. Feedback weakened, misallocation accumulated, and adjustment slowed as decisions became increasingly insulated from local conditions. No repression was required, but limits were still reached. Denial of subjective value. Soviet Union, 1928 to 1953. Economic value was officially treated as objective, defined through plan targets and labor inputs rather than consumer preference or local conditions. Prices were fixed, informal exchange criminalized, and alternative signals suppressed. The result was universal shortages and the constant re-emergence of unofficial markets. Value did not vanish, it went underground. Cambodia, 1975 to 1979. Value was defined entirely through revolutionary doctrine, with no tolerance for preference specialization or local knowledge. Allocation was enforced through extreme coercion. The outcome was total economic collapse and mass death, not because scarcity disappeared, but because information, choice, and value signals were violently erased. Denial of incentives. North Korea, post-1953. Economic outcomes were framed in terms of loyalty and ideological compliance rather than incentive response. Material feedback was replaced by surveillance and punishment. Productive incentives collapsed while informal markets emerged as the population's primary survival mechanism. Romania, 1965 to 1989. Economic failure was attributed to administrative non-compliance and execution errors rather than distorted incentives or rigid planning structures. As performance declined, enforcement escalated, replacing feedback with coercion. Productive behavior deteriorated further, adjustment mechanisms failed, and the system ultimately collapsed under accumulated misallocation. Rhetorical denial. Practical acceptance. The United States, post-2008. Market discipline is celebrated rhetorically, while selective intervention and discretionary bailouts dominate in practice. This institutional hypocrisy is managed through legal complexity rather than addressed openly, contributing to declining trust and political instability. The European Union, post-2010 Eurozone crisis. Market rules are emphasized in principle, but applied asymmetrically in practice. Discretion replaces rule consistency, and technocratic management substitutes for democratic clarity. The system persists, but legitimacy erodes. So, the pattern is clear. Deny scarcity, and you get propaganda. Deny choice, and you get authority. Deny subjective value, and you get coercion. Deny incentives, and you get punishment. Accept all of it in practice. Deny it rhetorically, and you get hypocrisy. Economics does not punish ideology. Reality does. And it always collects on time. Thank you for listening. I'm beyond left and right, and I hope you are too.